North Korea was threatening to attack Guam. NBC News confirms the U.S. now believes North Korea has the capacity to put a nuclear weapon on a missile. And while there is not consensus on this, the Defense Intelligence Agency, for one, believes they have achieved the miniaturization of a nuclear weapon. It's important to note here, NBC News says the latest advance does not mean North Korea has a nuclear-tipped intercontinental ballistic missile, according to a U.S. official briefed on the intelligence assessment. The Washington Post was the first to report this story, and of course, following the North's recent missile tests, the fear is they could soon produce a working ICBM with guidance enough to be capable of hitting U.S. population centers. Then this afternoon, the president hosted a session at the
Mouth Almighty
at his Bedminster, New Jersey golf resort. He appeared ready for a question from the press on North Korea, and he answered it.
North Korea best not make any more threats to the United States. They will be met with fire and fury like the world has never seen. He has been very threatening beyond a normal statement. And as I said, they will be met with fire, fury, and frankly power, the likes of which this world has never seen before. Thank you.
Hours after that, the North Koreans threatened a missile attack on Guam. For those not familiar with Guam, it's a U.S. territory, population 168,000 U.S. citizens. There are roughly 12,000 U.S. military and their dependents, family members. Roughly a third of the island is a U.S. military base. This genuine overseas threat comes at a low point in terms of public trust in this president. And just today, there were new poll numbers from CBS News on this very issue. Just 35% of Americans say they're confident in Trump's ability to handle the situation with North Korea's nuclear program. 61%, 6 in 10, say they are uneasy about it. North Korea was a problem when Trump walked into the White House when he was still a candidate last year. He did not seem to want to get involved, saying North Korea was Japan's problem and they should take care of it.
The case could be made that let them protect themselves against North Korea. They'd probably wipe them out pretty quick. And if they fight, you know what? That'll be a terrible thing. Terrible. Good luck, folks. Enjoy yourself. So, North Korea has nukes. Japan has a problem with that. I mean, they have a big problem with it. Maybe they would, in fact, be better off if they defend themselves from North Korea. Maybe we would be better off, including with nukes. Yes, including with nukes.
Now, here is what he has said about North Korea since becoming president.
The first thing I brought up was North Korea. Now, he then explains thousands of years of history with Korea. Not that easy. In other words, not as simple as people would think. As far as North Korea is concerned, we are in very good shape. Whether we want to talk about it or not, North Korea is a big world problem. It's a problem we have to finally solve. It should have been handled by President Obama. It should have been handled by other presidents in the past. All options are on the table. That I can say. I wish we would have a little more help with respect to North Korea from China, but that doesn't seem to be working out. The era of strategic patience with the North Korean regime has failed. As far as North Korea is concerned, I don't know. We'll see what happens. I don't like to talk about what I have planned. We'll handle North Korea. We're going to be able to handle it. It will be handled. We handle everything.
Then there's this. Perhaps the most sobering quote of the evening came during an interview with a nuclear expert, the head of a global security foundation. He was interviewed on the Rachel Maddow program earlier tonight.
The seriousness of this situation cannot be overestimated, not because North Korea can hit us in a bolt-out-of-the-blue attack that could take out Los Angeles or Seattle. No. What you're worried about is that you have two insecure, inexperienced, impulsive leaders in control of a vast amount of destructive force, squaring off in the most heavily militarized area on Earth. They are blowing through this president's red lines like tissue paper. What is Trump going to do now?
That got our attention for good reason, and with that, let's bring in tonight's starting panel. NBC News Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent Andrea Mitchell, retired four-star U.S. Army General Barry McCaffrey, an MSNBC military analyst with experience in government and military matters throughout the world, and Malcolm Nance, a 35-year intelligence veteran, including with Naval Intelligence, Special Operations, and Homeland Security, also happens to be an MSNBC analyst. So, Andrea, you have covered this on and off for some time. What about the president's words, if anything, struck you as coordinated, vetted?
Mouth almighty.
And then the second part of the question is, how do you de-escalate from where he put this thing this afternoon?
Well, that is the harder question, isn't it? He seemed to be reading from notes. That was the only indication that this was planned. But planned by whom? Not by General Mattis. I'm just confident of that. I know that he has said publicly that any kind of military option would be catastrophic. I know how he has briefed people on Capitol Hill in classified briefings. I've gotten some readouts from that. And I don't believe this came from H.R. McMaster or from John Kelly. I don't know who other than Steve Bannon might have given the president those words. How do you pull back from that kind of red line? It's really extraordinary. Look, the B-1 bomber has been flying out of Guam continuously for a month now since that first ICBM was launched. And North Korea wasn't happy about it. There were some statements, but nothing like the threat against Guam. I think that's an empty threat, but it certainly is a rhetorical response to President Trump tonight. And we've got to find some way to de-escalate this.
Malcolm, this is why we keep saying credibility matters. Let's start with the letter A. Do you believe the intelligence that kicked this whole thing off today?
You know, I've seen several escalations of, rhetoric like this that occurred over the last 25 years, most notably the run-up to the war in Iraq. It always starts off with intelligence, and this particular intelligence assessment that we've seen in the Post today is peculiar, only because 6 months ago the assessment is that North Korea couldn't miniaturize that warhead for 2 years. About a month ago that was accelerated to early next year, about 6 months to 9 months out. Now we are at 0 hour, where they believe that it has already been done. This came from Defense Intelligence Agency, which their principal collection process is going to be imagery intelligence. It's possible North Korea may have done this, and they have very good intelligence. It's also possible North Korea may have placed in their line of sight imagery which would, a device which could look like that, and now they're accelerating their assessment, or it could be, a miscalculation. Either way, if this is true, there has already been an intelligence failure on this point.
General McCaffrey, when you're on, we often talk about the generals surrounding this president. Names like Mattis, Kelly, and McMaster. Do you think, given your experience, they glanced at or had any knowledge of the language the president was going to use this afternoon in Bedminster?
Not a chance. I don't know who, but the president might have jotted those notes himself. It might have been somebody around him, but that was never signed off on after a top secret coordinated telephone call among government agencies. Look, Jim Mattis, fortunately, is a thoughtful, stable guy with tremendous experience. I'm sure right now he's reaching out to his military contacts throughout the world. Kelly is the same kind of person, but they're dealing with a president with an incoherent worldview. And Lion, I would just assert, never in my experience has any president
a TV worldview
made this kind of a blustering statement, never mind implying the use of nuclear weapons. You don't threaten people in public, you threaten them in private, and then you have to be prepared to follow through with what the threat was. So this is a real blunder on the part of Mr. Trump.
General, I've listened to a lot of military experts in the last 24 hours, especially on cable news. None that I've seen know the weight of 8 stars on their shoulders as you do, but many of them enjoy talking about a surgical, limited U.S. military strike on North Korea. Can you please share with our audience the risks of such a thing?
Well, first of all, it's simply not going to happen. There are planning options, I'm sure, that run the whole gamut from special forces teams in North Korea to cyber warfare to limited conventional air power, predators, global hawk, etc. But there is zero chance that we can guarantee we know where all those nuclear sites are and can strike them successfully. Now, if it was all-out war, Brian, within 6 months or less, we will have destroyed the North Korean armed forces and their government. But in the process, of course, it'll be a tragedy of enormous proportions, not just in the Korean Peninsula, but possibly also including Japan and maybe even Australia. So the North Koreans know we're not going to conduct a strike. It's not going to happen. We're going to have to negotiate and try and hem them in and provide ballistic missile defense systems.
Andrea, I know you've been struck by the tone from Secretary of State Tillerson on this subject. That is so not what we saw earlier today.
He's still in the region. He just landed in Kuala Lumpur. He's still on his mission, flying and stopping in Bangkok yesterday on his way back from that Asian Pacific summit. Look, there is diplomacy in play. We saw it at the United Nations. There's pressure. This could have been a signal to Beijing as well, listen up, take this seriously. He could have been President Trump sending signals in a number of directions, but so ill-considered. You have reactions tonight from John McCain and from Dianne Feinstein. Dianne Feinstein saying that this is so ill-considered, that it's bombastic, that it is not helpful, that the only sure path is a diplomatic path. And I know she's been briefed by the military. She's a member of the Intelligence Committee, but I know personally that there have been briefings there. And from John McCain saying that no other American president that he's ever known would have used this language. Not Eisenhower, not Reagan, not any other president. And that if you're going to, use the big Teddy Roosevelt stick, you've got to be prepared to use it. And he does not think President Trump is prepared to use that. And as to a surgical strike, General McCaffrey knows better than anyone. It's simply not possible. If you saw a missile on a launch pad, which we are not likely to see with as much lead time because they're now using solid-state fuel and they're using mobile launchers and they're on underground rails and hidden targets. But if you did see it ready to launch and had intelligence, then maybe you could take something out and then still risk the retaliatory artillery strike, the fusillade that would wipe out through conventional weapons most of Seoul, 25 million people, 28,000 U.S. troops, 100,000 American civilians. But that would be the only instance where you might even think about something preemptively.
Malcolm, our job tonight actually is to scare people to death on this subject, so the talk isn't as free as it is about a preemptive or surgical military strike. You know that part of the world. The population centers, Andrea and the General have talked about, South Korea, the Japanese, and so on and so on.
Well, it's very true. As Andrea and the General put just so succinctly, this is not a viable military option. This is not Syria. This is not Iran. This is a hard rock of a military target. They have capabilities that are still the same from 1954, when the Korean War ended. So if you launch a cruise missile, they'll have 1,000 machine guns up there literally shooting them out of the sky. This is an ant farm that you will have to go in physically to dig out. And the only way to get that nuclear program, unfortunately, is to use a nuclear weapon. And with this kind of bombast, the North Koreans, they love provocation. They're going to believe that that's where you're going to go ultimately. That regime wants to survive. But if the president believes that the Department of Defense can hand him the intelligence and the capability to carry out any type of consequences from that, then they're being highly unrealistic, and it will cost thousands of people their lives.
Hey, General, take 45 seconds and do what you often do. Remind our audience what kind of state this is we're talking about, how much of the function, the focus of their society and money has gone into a military all these years.
Well, by the way, it's also a third-tier military. You know, except for their submarine force and their special forces, they're not really very capable at all. Having said that, the conventional artillery strike on the populated areas, the 25 million people in Seoul, is enormous. And I think we should also take into account, you know, that North Korea is essentially an army wrapped in a impoverished country. 34% of the military age population is in the active or reserve armed forces. So, you know, the whole thing survives because Kim Jong-un and his father and grandfather said, we're an immediate threat. He needs the threat to survive. He's also unpredictable. We don't know what the generals are willing to tell him. They get shot for annoying him. So I think it's a risky situation. It's time for calm, thoughtful language.
We could have no better guest to start off our conversation or our broadcast tonight. Our great thanks to Andrea Mitchell, Barry McCaffrey, Malcolm Nance. Thank you all.